So maybe first it would be really important just to paint a picture of what's been happening in early childhood development, because I think the trends that we've seen during the pandemic were actually endemic of what's been happening in the sector historically. So for example, we know that over 1 million children between the ages of 3 to 5 years of age do not have access to any form of early learning. This has been exacerbated during the pandemic, as we saw through the general household survey data, because a lot of parents, either due to lockdown restrictions or for fears of safety, chose to keep their children at home. This meant that those who were accessing some form of early learning obviously fell behind. But what that also means is that even with the country reopening up and more early childhood development centers opening up, that might not necessarily mean that children are accessing those services.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, when we're talking about the effects of those 2 years or almost 3 years really of Covid-19 pandemic, and how much and to what extent really can we talk about the effect that it had on the childhood development sector? I mean, I'm wondering how much, you know, a child that would have been 2 years ahead would now be maybe a couple of steps back now. To what extent are we talking?
Yes, and I think possibly the data that we can look at that can really give us an indication of what has been lost is to look at the recent Thrive by 5 data. So Thrive by 5 is an index that is South Africa's first nationally representative survey looking at preschool children. The data set was released earlier this year, and what it indicated is that actually there's really the strong relationship between income inequality and poor outcomes for children. And this has been exacerbated during the pandemic. So what we also saw in the Thrive by 5 data is that actually a lot of children who are attending early learning programs are falling behind or failing to meet some of the tasks expected of children in their age group. So what do we mean when we're talking about this? So specifically, the index looked at a number of different areas. So for example, fine motor skills. So here we're talking about children being able to hold a pen, a pencil, or being able to draw. Early literacy, early numeracy, executive function, so being able to solve problems and pay attention. So if we know from the general household survey data that children were not attending early learning programs, we can then extrapolate and begin to understand that actually in these kinds of really critical areas of development, children were not having access to opportunities to learn and be stimulated. So what that means is that over the long term, these children are not on track to reach their key developmental milestones. And that actually is critical because it has knock-on effects on their ability to perform in school, their ability to perform relatively well in matric and maybe obtain further learning and training opportunities, and their ability to compete adequately in the labor market.
I can say, you know, unfortunately, inequality is something that, you know, will be with us for a very long time. It's a huge problem in South Africa, especially when it comes to education in South Africa. So I think you're talking about the issue of bridging this particular gap. But how do we do that when the gap of inequality is so far and wide and so big in South Africa that any of the programs and anything that someone tries to do, it really only causes a small dent in you know, making an effect on what is the long-term solution? How do we then begin to address this issue of that inequality that unfortunately will always be with us?
You know, Flo, that's such an important question. And that's why we do the work that we do in the early childhood development space, because we really see that by investing in early childhood development, ECD, we're able to actually intervene at a really critical juncture when an individual is developing. So if we're thinking about the South African case, as you so rightly say, where we're experiencing such high levels of inequality, that actually, if we really want to address structural poverty and injustice, we have to invest in early childhood development. What does that mean? I'm going to talk about 3 areas that we need to be focusing on. So the first really is ensuring that when we're talking about early childhood development, we know that we're not just speaking about access to early learning programs, but we're talking about support to parents. We're talking about access to nutrition. We're talking about maternal health care. These are all essential elements that make up early childhood development. Second to that, we need to really be investing in Black women who make up a majority of the individuals who are working in the early childhood development sector. So when we're talking about ECD practitioners or women who own small businesses that provide these services, a majority of them are Black women, and most of them are operating in the informal economy. So what that means is that we really need to be providing a context that is really supportive and actually allows these women to run small businesses that are successful, so that they can continue to increase access to early learning childhood development services. That will ensure that we actually close the supply gap. But in addition to that, by supporting Black women, we know that we're indirectly also supporting the communities that these Black women are working in. And then lastly, I want to talk about registration. So as I mentioned earlier, that a lot of these early childhood development centers or creches, if we want to talk about it informally, are operating and are not registered. So what that means is not necessarily that they're not providing good quality service, but that it's actually really quite an onerous process to get registered and then access government funding in order to deliver a better quality of service. So if we really want to invest in ECD, we have to invest at the policy level, we have to invest at the implementation level, and we have to support those who are doing this work in the front lines.
Yeah, and just on a different well, it's not entirely a different topic really, Kentse, but yesterday we saw Equal Education and other stakeholders, they marched against the Basic Education Department's proposal to remove deadlines to fix schools from the infrastructure law. Do you have a viewpoint in terms of what your views are on this particular proposal? Are you in support of it or not?
I think the work that the civil society sector has been doing in holding government accountable when it comes to education and educational outcomes, even when we're talking about infrastructure, because we know that has a real impact on how children learn and where they learn, is absolutely critical. So I think the support that we're showing is to say that actually we need a government that is supportive, that isn't punitive, but that actually is willing to work with educational institutions and teachers and practitioners in order to provide quality learning environments for children.
All right. Thanks very much, Kentse. A great pleasure talking to you. Thanks so very much for giving us your time here on SABC News.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.